Can I join you for a minute? The old man's voice didn't shake. It didn't beg. It landed like a quiet grenade in the center of the most dangerous room in Montana. Every biker in that bar stopped breathing. Derek Wolf Maddox, 6'4", 260 pounds of controlled fury, slowly turned around. And for the first time in 20 years, the most feared man in 3 states looked like he was about to collapse. If this story moves you, subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far one old man's courage can travel. The cold came in before the motorcycles did. It always did in November in Garnett County, Montana, that specific kind of cold that didn't just bite at your skin, but crawled underneath it, settled into your joints, made your bones feel like they were made of something fragile. The kind of cold that reminded you that the land out here didn't care whether you lived or died. The highway stretched in both directions like a scar across the frozen earth, and the only light for 11 miles in any direction came from the neon beer signs flickering in the window of a place called Roadkills. It wasn't a clever name. It wasn't meant to be. Roadkills had been sitting at the intersection of Route 12 and nothing since 1974, and in all that time it had developed a reputation that kept most reasonable people away. The floorboards were warped. The bar stools were held together with electrical tape and stubborn loyalty. The jukebox in the corner played the same 43 songs on rotation, and 3 of them were broken records that skipped at the same lyric every single time, but nobody ever complained, because complaining at Roadkills was the kind of behavior that got you carried out instead of walked out. On a Tuesday night in the second week of November, Roadkills had about 32 customers. Truckers, ranch hands. 2 women at the far end of the bar who'd been nursing the same 2 beers for an hour and a half. A retired sheriff named Cal, who sat on the same stool every Tuesday and never spoke to anyone. And in the corner booth, the one closest to the back door, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that had been patched 11 times, an 84-year-old man named Walter Hayes sat alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Walter wasn't a big man. He never had been, even when he was young. 5'8" on a generous day, and now age had borrowed an inch of that back. His hands were spotted and knuckled with arthritis. His hair had gone fully white sometime around the year his wife Margaret died, which was 6 years ago, and he hadn't bothered to cut it properly since. He wore a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the red had faded to something closer to rust, and over it a canvas jacket with a small American flag pin on the lapel, the kind they handed out at VA events, the cheap ones with the bent clasps. But his eyes were the color of a winter river gray with something moving underneath, and they were completely unnervingly steady. He'd been nursing that cold coffee for 40 minutes, not reading anything, not looking at his phone, just sitting with his hands folded on the table, staring at the door with the calm, patient focus of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had made his peace with the waiting. The door opened. The cold came in again, sharper this time, intentional, and then the sound followed. The deep, layered, bone-shaking rumble of multiple large engines idling down in the parking lot, one by one. Then all at once. Then silence. Nobody moved. Cal, the retired sheriff, set his glass down very carefully without making a sound. The 2 women at the bar didn't look at each other, but their shoulders rose by a fraction of an inch. The bartender, a thick man named Denny, who'd broken up 4 serious fights in the past year and a half, reached under the bar with one hand and rested it on something that wasn't the bar rag. The door opened. Derek Maddox had to turn his shoulders slightly to fit through the frame. That was the first thing you noticed about him. Not the leather cut with the red and white death's head patch on the back. Not the beard that was longer than most men's marriages. Not the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. It was the sheer physical fact of him. The way he occupied space like a structure, not a person. Like something that had been built rather than born. He was 47 years old, and he moved like a man who had been in enough rooms where something terrible happened that he'd learned to read every room in the first 3 seconds. His eyes swept the bar, left, right, back, left, a combat scan, automatic unconscious. Old training that never fully switched off. Behind him, 6 more men filed in, each one wearing the same cut, each one carrying themselves with the specific practiced looseness of men who wanted you to think they were relaxed so you wouldn't notice how alert they actually were. The music from the jukebox kept playing for about 4 more seconds. Then somebody unplugged it. Nobody ever admitted to doing it, It just went silent. Derek walked to the bar. He didn't look at anyone directly. He sat on a stool and said 2 words to Denny. "Whiskey. Neat." Denny poured it without a word. His hand was steady, which was impressive. The 6 men spread out. 2 took a table. 2 stood near the door. 1 leaned against the wall by the jukebox. The last one, a younger man with a neck tattoo that spelled something in Gothic script, sat at the beer 2 stools down from Derek and ordered nothing, just stared at the label on an empty beer bottle like it owed him money. Walter Hayes watched all of this. He watched Derek take the whiskey and hold it without drinking it, just turning the glass slowly with 2 fingers, staring at nothing in particular. Walter had spent 40 years as a high school history teacher in Billings before he retired, and before that he'd done 2 years in Vietnam as a medic, and somewhere in between all of that he'd developed the ability to look at a man, really look at him and understand things about that man that the man himself hadn't fully understood yet. What Walter saw when he looked at Derek Maddox was not what everyone else in the bar was seeing. Everyone else was seeing the patches, the beard, the size, the casual radiating threat of him. Walter saw a man who was exhausted down to the marrow, a man whose hands wrapped around that whiskey glass had the particular tension of someone gripping something to keep from sinking. A man with the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. It was the stillness of someone who had turned everything inside himself down to the lowest possible setting, because turning it off completely wasn't an option. Walter had seen that before. He'd seen it in the mirror after Vietnam. He'd seen it on his son Ethan's face during the last video call they'd had, the one 6 weeks before Ethan's convoy hit the roadside bomb outside Kandahar. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. His fingers found what they were looking for, not by searching, but by memory, the way your hand finds a doorknob in a dark room you've lived in for 30 years. He held the object in his closed fist for a moment, just feeling the weight of it. The metal had been warm from his body heat. He'd carried it close to his chest every single day for the past 8 years. He opened his hand and looked at it. A military bracelet, paracord, and a metal plate. The metal was dark brown in the grooves that wasn't rust. Walter knew what it was. He'd known the first moment the Army chaplain put it in his hands at the kitchen table in Billings and told him it was among the personal effects recovered from the site. He closed his hand around it again, stood up. Every single person in Roadkills who happened to be looking in that direction stopped mid-breath when they saw where the old man was walking. Denny, the bartender, made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a warning, something that died in his throat before it became either one. Cal, the retired sheriff, turned on his stool by 3 degrees and then stopped himself because he was also not a stupid man. Walter Hayes walked across the barroom floor toward Derek Maddox with the same unhurried, deliberate pace he had used to walk to the front of a classroom for 40 years. Not fast, not slow, like a man who had decided on a direction and was comfortable with whatever waited at the end of it. He stopped 2 feet away from the biggest biker in the room. Derek felt the presence before he fully registered it. Some combat-wired instinct turned his head. His eyes dropped, adjusted for height, found the old man's face. His jaw tightened. "Can I join you for a minute?" Walter's voice was quiet, not timid, quiet the way a river is quiet with considerable depth underneath. For 4 full seconds, nobody in the bar made a sound. Derek stared at the old man. His eyes ran across him the same way they'd run across the room searching, measuring, finding nothing that matched his threat assessment. An old man, canvas jacket, flannel shirt, American flag pin, eyes like a winter river. "You lost," Derek said. His voice was low, controlled, with a texture like gravel under a boot. "No," Walter said simply. "I know exactly where I am." He paused. "Do you mind if I sit down? My knees aren't what they were." One of the bikers near the door made a short sound, not quite a laugh, more like a warning disguised as one. The young man with the neck tattoo turned on his stool and looked at Derek with an expression that said, "You want me to handle this?" Derek held up 2 fingers without looking at him, the universal signal that meant don't. He looked at Walter for another long moment. Then he nodded once at the empty stool beside him. Walter sat down. He set his closed fist on the bar, then opened it slowly. The bracelet lay in his palm. Derek's eyes went to it, and something happened to his face that nobody in that room had ever seen happen to it before. The controlled stillness cracked just at the edges, just for a fraction of a second, like the surface of a frozen lake when you put too much weight on one spot. "Where did you get that?" Derek said. It wasn't quite a question. His voice had dropped to something barely above a breath. My son was wearing it, Walter said the night he died. Derek didn't move. His hands were both on the bar now, flat, completely still, and Walter could see the tendons along his forearms, standing out like cables under tension. My name is Walter Hayes, Walter said. Ethan was my boy. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had fallen when the motorcycles pulled in. That first silence had been fear. This one was something else entirely, something more complicated, something that had weight and texture and history pressed into it. Derek's throat moved once. You should leave, he said. His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. You could hear the cost if you were listening closely. Walter was listening closely. I've been looking for you for 3 years, Walter said. Not accusatory, not emotional, just factual the way you'd state the distance between two cities. I'm not going to leave. I don't know what Ethan told you. He told me you were the best man he ever served with, Walter said. He told me that in the last letter he wrote, the one dated 4 days before the convoy. Derek turned his head away. His jaw worked. The scar along his face pulled slightly. He told me something else too, Walter continued. He kept his voice low, kept it between the two of them because whatever was happening on Derek Maddox's face right now was not something a man should have witnessed by a barroom full of strangers. He told me that if anything happened to him, he hoped the men he served with would find their way home, not back to wherever they came from. Home. He said there's a difference. Derek's hands flat on the bar curled into fists. You don't know anything about what happened over there, he said. The words came out rough, stripped of the control he'd had on them 2 minutes ago. No, Walter agreed. I don't. I wasn't there. He paused. But you were, and you've been carrying it alone ever since, haven't you? Nobody breathed. The young biker with the neck tattoo had stopped pretending to look at the beer bottle. He was staring openly now, and he wasn't the only one. But none of them moved because something was happening at that bar that none of them had language for, and instinct told every person in the room to hold very still. Derek turned and looked at Walter. And for the first time, Walter saw it fully, what was underneath the size and the beard and the patches and the practiced stillness. He'd suspected it from across the room. He could see it clearly now. Grief, raw, unprocessed, years-old grief, the kind that had nowhere to go, and so had turned inward and built walls and called the walls a personality. You have no idea, Derek said. His voice cracked on the last word. Not much, just enough. You have absolutely no idea. Then tell me, Walter said, the two most dangerous words in any language deployed by an 84-year-old man in a Montana biker bar with the calm authority of someone who had earned the right to say them. Derek stared at him. Then he picked up the whiskey glass and drained it in one pull and set it back down hard enough to make the bar shake slightly. You want to know what happened? His voice had gone to a register that was almost inaudible. Your son pushed me out of the line of fire. He got me behind a blown truck, gave me his radio, told me to call the extraction, said he'd cover me. Derek stopped. His jaw worked again. He said he'd cover me. Walter was very still. By the time the birds came in, Derek said, there was nothing left to cover. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then he opened them again, and they were still steady, still that gray river color, but something moved through them. Not weakness, not collapse, but grief, acknowledged grief that had been lived with for 8 years and had learned to coexist with the man carrying it. I know, Walter said quietly. They told me. Then why are you here? Derek's voice was raw now. The control was gone. He wasn't performing anything anymore. Why are you sitting here talking to me? I'm the reason your son is dead. No, Walter said, with a conviction so absolute that it filled the space between them like something solid. You are the reason my son's choice meant something. He chose to save you. That was Ethan. That was who he was. And the only way that choice gets wasted, Walter's voice tightened just slightly, is if the man he saved doesn't live a life worth saving. The sound Derek Maddox made was not something any of the bikers in that room had ever heard from him. It was not loud. It was barely anything at all. It was the sound of something that had been holding itself together for a very long time under enormous pressure, finally finding one small crack and releasing through it. His head dropped. His shoulders, those massive wall-like shoulders, curved inward. And the most feared president of the most feared motorcycle club in 3 states pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and shook. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away, not because they were being disrespectful, but because they were witnessing something so purely human that it seemed almost wrong to blink, like you might miss something irreplaceable. Walter reached across and placed the bracelet, Ethan's bracelet, on the bar in front of Derek. "He wanted you to have it," Walter said. "It took me a while to figure out how to find you, and then it took me a while longer to figure out how to do this, but here I am." Derek stared at the bracelet. His hand moved to it slowly, the way you'd reach for something you believed might not be real if you touched it. His fingers closed around it. He held it the same way Walter had held it, with his whole hand, like it was something that might escape if you didn't hold it tightly enough. "He talked about you," Derek said finally, his voice stripped down to something barely functional. "All the time. Said his old man was the toughest person he had ever met. Said you'd survived Vietnam without losing your mind, and he didn't know how you did it." Walter smiled, just slightly. "I lost it a little bit," he admitted. "I just kept that part private." Derek looked up. His eyes were red. The scar on his face was dark. He looked in that moment not like a monster or a president or a legend or a threat. He looked like a man in his late 40s who hadn't slept properly in years and had been carrying a weight that was larger than he was and had long since stopped believing anyone could see it. "I didn't know what to do," Derek said. "After. I didn't know how to go back to being anything. Normal didn't make sense, so I just..." He gestured vaguely at his cut at the patches at the room around him. "I just kept moving, kept making noise. If you make enough noise, you don't have to hear yourself think." "I know," Walter said. "I taught high school for 30 years after Vietnam. Different kind of noise, same principle." Something moved across Derek's face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, something that had forgotten how to get all the way there but was trying to remember the direction. "Why now?" Derek asked. "Why'd you wait? Why not right after?" "I had to grieve first," Walter said simply. "That took time, and then I had to figure out what I actually wanted, whether I was coming to blame you or to..." He paused, searching for the right word. "To finish something. It took me a while to figure out which one it was." Derek looked at him steadily. "Which one is it?" Walter met his gaze. "I'm finishing what my son started," he said. "He brought you home once. I'm here to do it again." The bar was so quiet you could hear the neon signs buzzing in the window. You could hear the wind pushing against the walls outside. You could hear Derek Maddox breathing slow, careful breaths, the kind of breathing you do when you're trying very hard to hold on to yourself. He looked down at the bracelet in his fist. He looked at the old man beside him. He looked briefly at his own reflection in the bar mirror, a thing he normally avoided with the practiced skill of someone who had made a deliberate decision not to look. Whatever he saw there made his jaw tighten. "I'm not a good person," he said. "Not a confession, a warning. My son trusted you with his life," Walter said. "I'll start from there and work forward." The bracelet moved in Derek's hand. He turned it once, twice, the way Walter had turned it over in his pocket every day for 8 years, finding the grooves worn smooth by repetition and time. One of the bikers near the door shifted his weight. The floorboard creaked. It was the only sound anyone had made in the past 7 minutes besides the 2 men at the bar. Derek looked up. His eyes found the young man with the neck tattoo first, then swept the room, the same 3-second combat scan, but different now, like he was seeing the room from a slightly different angle than the one he'd walked in with. He looked back at Walter. "You want some coffee?" he said finally, his voice still rough, still low. But something had shifted in it, some harmonic that had been there since he walked through the door had gone quiet. Walter looked down at his own mug, cold and forgotten, on the bar behind him, where Denny had quietly moved it at some point during the last 10 minutes. "Mine's gone cold," he said. Derek turned toward Denny, who had been standing at the far end of the bar, making himself as inconspicuous as a large man behind a bar can make himself. "2 coffees," Derek said. Denny poured them without a word. His hand this time was slightly less steady. Walter wrapped both hands around the warm mug and felt the heat move into his arthritic fingers, and thought about his son, who had sat at a table in Kandahar province 8 years ago and written a letter that began, "Dad, if you are reading this, then something happened. Don't be angry. I need you to find someone for me." He had found him. The bracelet was where it belonged. And in the corner booth where Walter had been sitting all evening, The one closest to the back door, the one with the cracked vinyl seat, a cup of coffee sat cooling, and outside the Montana wind threw itself against the walls of Roadkill's bar without mercy. And the highway beyond was empty, in both directions stretching toward a horizon that was dark and enormous and full of whatever came next. Walter Hayes took a sip of coffee, waited, and for the first time in 3 years, maybe longer, Derek Maddox began to talk. Derek talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Walter didn't interrupt once. That was something Derek noticed early, maybe 15 minutes in when he said something that he expected would make the old man flinch. Something ugly about the weeks after the ambush, about what he'd done and where he'd gone, and the kind of men he'd surrounded himself with because they were the only ones who didn't ask questions he couldn't answer. He braced for the judgment, the pullback, the careful repositioning that people did when they realized the person they were talking to was further gone than they'd assumed. Walter just held his coffee mug and nodded. So Derek kept going. He talked about Afghanistan the way men who've been there talk about it when they finally talk about it at all in pieces. Not in order circling the center of it the way you'd circle something hot, getting closer by degrees. He talked about the dust, about how the dust got into everything, your food, your gear, your lungs, your sleep, about how you stopped noticing it after the first 3 weeks, and then when you came home, you noticed the absence of it more than you'd ever noticed the thing itself. He talked about Ethan. He didn't use his name at first. He said your son and Hayes and the captain, and it wasn't until the second cup of coffee that he finally said Ethan out loud, and when he did, his jaw tightened afterward like he was checking to see if saying it had caused structural damage somewhere. He was the kind of officer you don't expect to get, Derek said. The kind that you know how most of them come in, and they've got the rank, and they want you to feel the rank. Ethan came in, and the first thing he did was ask every man in the unit where they were from. Not as a thing officers do, he actually wanted to know. And he remembered. 3 weeks later, he'd ask you about your brother's job interview or whether your mother's surgery had gone okay. Every single man. Derek stopped, set the coffee mug down. You don't forget an officer like that, though. No, Walter said quietly, you don't. He used to talk about you, Derek said. His eyes moved to the bar surface. Not the way guys talk about their dads to fill silence. He actually told stories. You and him going fishing outside Billings when he was 12, and you teaching him to be patient, and him being constitutionally incapable of being patient and spending 3 hours and catching nothing and being furious about it. The corner of Derek's mouth moved. He said you sat there the whole time reading a paperback, and you looked so satisfied that he wanted to throw the fishing rod at you. Walter laughed. It was a small sound, but it was real. That was a good day, Walter said. He thought so too, Derek said. He said it taught him more about war than anything at the academy. Something about how most of the job is waiting, and the waiting will break you if you let it. They sat with that for a moment. Then Derek said, the night of the ambush, I need you to understand something. I tried to stop him. I grabbed his arm. I said, Hayes, don't we hold position? He looked at me and he said, Derek's voice shortened. He stopped, restarted. Someone has to make the call, Wolf. Today it's mine to make. And then he was gone, moving, and I was on the radio calling in the extraction coordinates, and I could hear the gunfire, and I kept talking into the radio, and I kept thinking he's going to come back around that truck any second. Any second he's going to come around that truck. Walter's hands tightened around the mug. He didn't come around the truck, Derek said. No, Walter said. He didn't. The words sat between them like something neither man could pick up and neither man could leave alone. Derek looked at Walter directly, then really looked at him the way he hadn't allowed himself to since the old man sat down, because looking directly at the father of the man whose death you'd been wearing for 8 years was a specific kind of confrontation that required a certain preparation, and Derek hadn't had it yet. I should have died that day, Derek said, not dramatically, factually, the way you'd say the temperature outside. Statistically, tactically. By any measure of how that situation was structured, I should have died and Ethan should have walked out. He was faster, he was smarter in the field. He had better instincts under fire. He shook his head slowly. There is no version of that night that makes sense to me. I've run it 10,000 times. Stop running it, Walter said. Derek looked at him sharply. I'm serious, Walter said, and his voice was gentle, but it had iron underneath it. You've been running the same calculation for 8 years, and it keeps coming back wrong because you're trying to find a version where you deserve to be alive, and there isn't one. Not because you don't deserve it, because that's not how it works. Ethan didn't save you because you'd earned it. He saved you because he loved you. You don't earn love like that. You just receive it. Derek said nothing for a long moment. That's not how I'm built, he finally said. I know, Walter said. That's why I'm here. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the bar then. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It wasn't visible. But the bikers who had been positioned around the room, the two by the door, the one by the jukebox, had relaxed by degrees over the past 2 hours without realizing they'd done it. And now the youngest one, the one with the neck tattoo, had moved from the bar to a table and was nursing an actual drink. And Denny, the bartender, had stopped keeping his hand near the thing under the bar. And Cal, the retired sheriff, had turned back to face front and was pretending very hard to be interested in a cocktail napkin. The bar had recalibrated around what was happening in the corner without anyone deciding to let it. Derek picked up the bracelet from the bar where he'd set it between his coffee mug and his empty whiskey glass. He turned it in his fingers. The metal plate caught the bar light. Ethan Hayes, U.S. Army, Captain, blood type, service number. He wrote me a letter, Derek said. Did you know that he wrote letters to all his men? Not the standard ones, personal ones. He gave them to the unit chaplain sealed, said to deliver them if he stopped. I never read mine. Walter looked at him. I burned it, Derek said. The chaplain gave it to me at the base. I put it in my pocket, got on the flight home, sat in my apartment in Tucson for 11 days. On the 12th day, I got the letter out and I held it for about an hour and then I burned it over the kitchen sink. He said it without apology, without drama. Just reported it. I couldn't read his words knowing he was dead. I couldn't have his voice in my head again. I already couldn't get it out. Walter absorbed this. What did you do after the 11 days, he asked. Found the nearest place that would take me without questions, Derek said. He touched the patch on his cut without looking at it. I had skills that translated. Violence, Walter said. Leadership, Derek said. And then after a beat, and violence. And it worked, Walter asked. Keeping busy that way. Did it work? Derek looked at him with something close to incredulity. Like the question was so plainly answered by the evidence of the last 8 years that asking it was almost funny. No, he said. It doesn't work. It just keeps working. There's a difference. Walter nodded slowly. There is, he agreed. That's exactly right. That's the smartest thing you've said all night. Derek blinked. He hadn't expected to be complimented. His expression did something complicated, part resistance, part something he couldn't name. The way a muscle that's been locked in tension for years responds the first time someone releases the pressure. I need to ask you something, Walter said. He set the coffee mug down. He folded his hands on the bar. And I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Derek waited. What would Ethan think, Walter said, if he could see how you've spent the last 8 years? The question hit Derek like something physical. His chin came up, his jaw locked. For a moment, he looked like he was going to push back from the bar stand, uppy in the conversation the way he ended most things that got too close with abrupt, decisive removal of himself from the situation. He didn't. He sat there, and he let the question work on him. And the working of it was visible, which was the thing that made every person in the bar who was watching, and they were all watching now, quietly pretending not to hold their breath. He'd be disappointed, Derek said finally. His voice was flat and quiet. Not angry. Ethan didn't do angry the way most people do. He'd be disappointed. A pause. Which is worse? Yes, Walter agreed. It is. I can't undo 8 years, Derek said. Nobody's asking you to, Walter said. I'm not here for an accounting. I'm not here to collect a debt. He looked at Derek steadily. I'm asking you what happens next, that's all. Just next. Derek's fingers closed around the bracelet again. You're a persistent man, Walter, he said. He said the name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. Like he hadn't used someone's actual name in a conversation in a long time. I'm a retired school teacher from Billings, Walter said. Persistence is the whole job. And there it was, Derek Maddox, president of the most feared motorcycle club in the Northern Rockies, looked at an 84-year-old man and laughed. It was a short sound, rough-edged like something that had forgotten the shape of itself. But it was real. It was completely and undeniably real. The young biker with the neck tattoo heard it from his table, and his head came up, and he stared at Derek like he was seeing something that belonged to another species. The laugh faded. Derek shook his head slightly, looked down at the bracelet. "I don't know how to be anything else," he said. The humor was gone as quickly as it had arrived, raw again underneath. "I'm not being dramatic. I genuinely don't know how. I've been doing this for 8 years. I don't know what the other side of it looks like." "You don't have to know what it looks like," Walter said. "You just have to take the first step toward it. The picture fills in later." "That's very poetic," Derek said. "Very teacher of you." "I taught history," Walter said. "History is full of men who didn't know what they were walking toward. Most of the good ones didn't." Derek looked at him. "And the bad ones?" "Thought they did," Walter said without hesitation. "Certainty is rarely the good sign people think it is." Derek sat with that. Then carefully, like a man who has been holding something heavy for so long that setting it down requires as much deliberate effort as picking it up, and Hattie said, "There's a kid in my club, 23 years old, name's Danny, grew up in foster care in Butte, smart kid, smart enough to have done anything else with himself. But he came in at 19 because we were the only thing that felt like structure, and I knew that, and I took him in anyway." He stopped. 3 nights ago, he put a man in the hospital. Not a rival, a civilian, a drunk guy who bumped into him at a gas station. His voice had gone tight. He's going to kill someone before he's 25. And I'm the reason he's in the position to do it. Walter didn't look away. "Does he know Ethan's story?" Walter asked. "Nobody knows Ethan's story," Derek said. "Nobody knows anything about me before the cut." "Maybe," Walter said carefully, "that's part of what needs to change." Derek looked at him for a long time. The bar had gone very quiet again, not the fearful quiet of 2 hours ago, but something deeper and more complicated, the quiet of a room full of people who were collectively realizing they were present for something they would be telling people about for years. "You said you've been looking for me for 3 years, Derek said. "I have." "Why not go to the police file, something plenty of people would have loved to help a veteran's father track down a Hells Angels president?" "Because I wasn't looking to destroy you," Walter said. "And I didn't trust anyone else to know the difference between finding you and destroying you." That landed hard. Derek's throat moved. "I came here tonight because I had information," Walter continued, "about this bar, about your Tuesday routine. Took me a long time to piece it together." He paused. "I sat in that corner booth for 4 hours before you arrived. I had 3 cups of coffee. I rehearsed what I was going to say approximately 40 times. He allowed himself the smallest smile. "None of the rehearsals went anything like this." "What did you think I was going to do?" Derek asked, "when you walked up." "I thought you might throw me out," Walter said honestly, "or have one of your men do it. I thought there was maybe a 20% chance you'd listen. I thought there was a small but real chance that tonight went very badly for me." Derek stared at him. "You came anyway." "I'm 84 years old," Walter said simply. "The risk calculus changes at my age." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind hammered the walls. Somewhere a truck passed on the highway, its headlights crossing the window briefly, and then the dark closed back in. Derek looked at the bracelet one final time. Then he did something that none of his men, not one of them, had ever seen him do in 8 years of riding together. He slipped the bracelet over his wrist, not as a performance, not as a statement. Quietly, the way you put on something that belongs on you, like correcting an absence you'd been ignoring. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't explain it. Walter saw it and looked back at his coffee. "There's a place," Walter said, "in Wyoming, outside Sheridan. A friend of mine runs it, Veterans Ranch. Ex-soldiers, most of them carrying things they don't have language for yet. They work with horses, rescue horses, mostly. Animals that have been through things too." He paused. "I've been going out there on weekends for about 2 years, helping where I can. My friend Tom, he's always got more men coming in than he has hands to handle it." Derek looked at him sideways. "Are you offering me a job on a horse ranch?" he said. His voice was flat, but not hostile, almost cautious, like he was checking to see if the thing he was hearing was actually the thing being said. "I'm offering you a door," Walter said. "What you do with it is entirely your business." The young biker with the neck tattoo. Danny Walter now realized the 23-year-old from Butte that Derek had just described was watching Derek with an expression that Walter could only describe as hungry, not aggressive hungry, searching hungry. The look of someone who has been waiting for a signal without knowing they were waiting for it. Derek turned and looked at him directly. Danny straightened slightly, defensive reflex. "You heard any of that?" Derek asked him. Danny's jaw worked. "Some of it," he admitted. "Which parts?" "Enough," Danny said quietly. The two of them held eye contact for a moment that carried more weight than most conversations manage in an hour. Then Derek looked back at Walter. "I need to think," he said. "Take all the time you need," Walter said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, a phone number written in the deliberate, careful handwriting of a man who was aware that his handwriting had deteriorated and was compensating. He set it on the bar next to Derek's empty whiskey glass. "Tom's Ranch and my number. Either one." Derek looked at the paper without touching it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not suspiciously, not defensively, with genuine stripped-down bewilderment. "You lost your son. I'm connected to that. Most people wouldn't sit in a bar for 4 hours waiting to offer the man connected to their son's death a chance at a horse ranch in Wyoming." Walter looked at him. "Because grief either makes you smaller or it makes you bigger," he said. "And I decided a long time ago that I was not going to let losing Ethan make me smaller." He pulled on his canvas jacket. He was too good a man to be mourned small. He stood up from the bar stool. His knees protested. They always did now, particularly in the cold. He steadied himself with one hand on the bar and then straightened to his full height, which wasn't impressive by any objective measure, but felt in that moment like something considerably larger than the physical facts. He looked at Derek one last time. "He was proud of you," Walter said. "I want you to know that." He said it directly in the letter. He said, "Wolf is the best of us, Dad, and he doesn't know it, and that's the part that worries me about him." He paused. "I thought you should have that, since you burned the one he wrote you." Derek's face did something that had no name. Walter turned and walked back across the bar floor. Same pace as before, unhurried, like a man who had accomplished what he came to do. He pushed through the front door and the cold hit him hard and immediate, and he stood in the parking lot, surrounded by the silhouettes of motorcycles, and pulled his jacket tighter and looked up at the Montana sky, which was vast and brutally clear and full of more stars than most people ever see. He stood there for a long moment. Behind him, through the walls of roadkills, he could hear nothing. Silence. The kind that comes after something has broken open. Walter Hayes walked to his truck, got in, sat for a minute before he started the engine. He put his hand where the bracelet had been in his inside pocket for 8 years. The pocket was empty. He started the truck, and he drove. Derek didn't sleep that night. He lay on the mattress in the back room of the club's Garnett County chapter house and stared at the ceiling and turned the bracelet on his wrist in the dark. Way Walter had turned it in his pocket by memory, by repetition, finding the grooves worn smooth by another man's years of carrying it. The metal plate was cool against his pulse point. He could feel his own heartbeat against it. That bothered him in a way he couldn't articulate and couldn't stop noticing. He got up at 4 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the folded piece of paper Walter had left on the bar. He didn't unfold it. He just set it on the table in front of him and looked at it like it was something that required careful handling. Like it was a document that once opened would change the terms of something he hadn't fully agreed to change yet. He sat there until 6. Then he folded it again, put it in the inside pocket of his cut, and went to find Danny. Danny was awake. He was always awake early. Another thing Derek had noticed about him, the way men who've spent time in the child welfare system often are, that particular hypervigilance that presents as early rising, because sleep requires a degree of trust in your environment that takes years to learn and longer to unlearn. He was in the garage with a cup of coffee and a motorcycle that didn't need the work he was doing on it, and when Derek came in, he looked up with the careful, neutral expression he used when he wasn't sure what version of Derek he was getting. "Sit down," Derek said. Danny sat on an overturned crate. Derek sat across from him on a workbench and was quiet for a moment. "The man at the bar last night," Derek said. "What did you make of him?" Danny considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Old," he said. "Not weak. There's a difference." He paused. "He walked up to you like he already knew how it was going to go, like he'd decided before he got there." He had, Derek said. He'd been deciding for 3 years. Danny looked at him, waited. Derek told him about Ethan. Not everything, some of it belonged only to him, only to the dark in the ceiling and the bracelet turning on his wrist at 4 in the morning. But enough. The convoy, the ambush, the choice Ethan made, and the life Derek had built in the wreckage of not being able to justify surviving it. Danny listened the way Walter had listened, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just absorbing it. When Derek finished, the garage was very quiet. "So what do you do now?" Danny asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Derek said. Danny looked at the motorcycle between them. He turned a wrench in his hands. "The thing you said last night about me putting that guy in the hospital." He didn't look up. "I knew you saw it different than the others did. They thought you'd be proud." "I know they did," Derek said. "Were you?" Derek looked at him directly. "No." Danny absorbed that. His jaw tightened slightly and then released the way it does when something lands hard and you decide not to let it show more than that. "Okay," he said quietly. "That man at the bar," Derek said, "told me something. He said his son saved my life because he loved me, not because I'd earned it." He paused. "I've been thinking about that all night, because the way I've been running this club, the way I've been running everything, it's been about earning, making sure everyone around me earns their place, earns their standing, earns the right to stay." He looked at Danny. "And you came in at 19 from a foster home in Butte, and you had nothing to earn with, and I let you in anyway." Danny's hand stopped moving on the wrench. "Why, Derek asked. Not harshly, genuinely. Danny's throat moved. "Because you said there was room," he said carefully. "There was room," Derek confirmed, "and I watched you for 4 years, and I saw exactly what you were and what you were going to become if you kept going the direction you were going." And I didn't say a word. His voice was steady, but there was something grinding underneath it. "That's on me, Danny, not on you. On me." The silence in the garage had a particular texture, the texture of something being rearranged. "So what happens now?" Danny asked again. His voice was different this time, less guarded. "I'm going to do something," Derek said, "that's going to cause problems. Big ones. And I need you to know about it before it happens, because how you respond to it is going to determine a lot about where you end up." Danny looked at him steadily, 23 years old with old eyes. "Tell me," he said. Derek reached up and put his hand on the death's head patch on his cut. He held it there for a moment. Then he said, "I'm walking away from the club." The wrench hit the concrete floor. Danny stared at him with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and something else. Something that looked, if you were reading it carefully, almost like relief, which was the last thing Derek had expected to see. "You can't," Danny said. The words were automatic reflex, not a challenge, a statement of what he believed to be physical law. "Wolf, you built this chapter. You've been president for 6 years. You can't just—" "Watch me," Derek said quietly. Danny picked up the wrench, set it on the workbench, ran his hand over his face. "Razor, he said. "Yes," Derek said. "He'll take over." "Yes, and then he'll come after you, huh?" "Probably." Danny stared at him. "And you're doing this anyway." "A man I trusted died so I could keep going," Derek said. "I've spent 8 years going in exactly the wrong direction. At some point, the debt has to mean something." He stood up. He reached into his inside pocket and took out the folded piece of paper with Walter's number and Tom's ranch in Wyoming and set it on the workbench next to the wrench. "There's a place," he said, "veterans, horses, a man named Tom who runs it, and an 84-year-old retired school teacher who helps out on weekends." He paused. "I'm going to go. You don't have to come. But if you want a door out of where you're headed, that piece of paper is it." He walked out of the garage before Danny could respond. He found the rest of the chapter at breakfast. 5 men, the ones who'd ridden with him into roadkills the night before. He stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at them, and they looked back at him, and something in his face made the conversation stop mid-sentence. "I'm calling a meet," Derek said. 1 hour. He spent that hour alone in the back room. He took off his cut and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. 6 years of his life. Every patch earned through something, some of the somethings things he was proud of, and some of them things that lived in the same dark territory as the Afghanistan memories, the things he ran from by making noise. He thought about the men he'd led, the loyalty that was real, and the loyalty that was just proximity to power, which looks the same from the outside and almost never is from the inside. He thought about Ethan saying someone has to make the call, Wolf. Today it's mine to make. He put the cut back on. Just for the meeting, he needed them to hear what he said as coming from the man they knew, not from whoever he was becoming. Transition required a known starting point. The meet was short. Derek said what he had to say. He didn't dress it up. He told them he was out, that leadership transferred to the next in seniority until the full club voted that he wished every man in the room the life they were looking for. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then one of the older men, a man named Cutter, who had ridden with Derek since the beginning, who had gray in his beard and a limp from a highway accident 3 years ago, said, "You're serious?" "Yes," Derek said. Cutter looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded once slowly and looked at the table and said nothing else, which from Cutter was the equivalent of a long speech. The younger men were less contained. 2 of them spoke at once, voices overlapping, words like betrayal and obligation, and what the hell happened last night, and who was that old man? Derek let them talk. He didn't argue. He answered what he could and left the rest alone, because some things can't be explained to someone who hasn't had the conversation that changes everything, and they hadn't had it. He walked out of the chapter house at 9:47 in the morning. He took off the cut in the parking lot, not dramatically, not as a performance, just efficiently, the way you take off something that no longer fits. He folded it over his arm. He put it back through the door without going inside again. He walked to his motorcycle. He sat on it without starting it for a full minute. Then he took out his phone and dialed the number on the paper. Walter's number, not the ranch. Walter. It rang 4 times. "I didn't expect to hear from you this soon," Walter said. His voice was unhurried, like he'd been awake for hours already doing ordinary things, and Derek's birthday call was entirely expected and entirely welcome. "I left the club," Derek said. A pause. Not shock, more like a man taking a moment to make sure he'd heard correctly and then choosing his response with care. "Are you all right?" Walter asked. It was such a simple question. It was the most direct thing anyone had asked Derek in years, and it hit him with a force completely disproportionate to its size. He gripped the phone tighter. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what all right feels like right now." "That's okay," Walter said. "That's actually a good sign. When you know too clearly how you feel, you're usually not paying attention." Derek looked at the road in front of him. The morning was gray and cold, and the highway stretched in both directions, and the sky was the color of old iron. "Tell me about the ranch," Derek said. Walter told him. He described Tom, ex-Army Ranger, 2 tours in Iraq, built the ranch from a foreclosure property 8 years ago because he'd lost 3 men from his unit to suicide in the same year and decided that waiting for someone else to build something was no longer a plan he could live with. He described the men who came through, some of them staying for a week, some for a season, some of them so broken when they arrived that the first 2 days were just about getting them to eat and sleep in a bed and not look at the exits every 3 minutes. He described the horses, the specific alchemy of a traumatized animal and a traumatized man finding each other across a fence line and recognizing something. Derek listened to all of it. "How far is it from Garnett County?" he asked. 7 hours, Walter said. "Give or take." "I'm going to need a few days," Derek said. "There are things I need to settle here, financially, practically." "Take the time you need," Walter said. "Tom's not going anywhere. I'll call him today." Derek almost hung up. Then he said, "Walter." "Yes. Last night, when you walked across that bar." He stopped, started again. "You knew you might not come out of that conversation okay." "I had a sense it might be complicated," Walter said carefully. "And you did it anyway," Derek said. "Yes, because of Ethan." "Because of Ethan," Walter confirmed, "and because some things are worth doing even when the outcome is uncertain. Especially then, actually." Derek looked at the bracelet on his wrist. "He picked well," he said. "His father." Walter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a slight roughness to it that hadn't been there before. "You call me when you're ready to drive," he said. "I'll meet you at the gate." Derek hung up. He started the motorcycle. He didn't know it yet, but 2 miles behind him, Danny was throwing a bag into the back of a truck. He'd read the piece of paper twice. He'd sat in the garage for 45 minutes after Derek walked out, turning the wrench in his hands, looking at the phone number. He'd thought about the man in the hospital. He'd thought about what 24 would look like, and then what 30 would look like if he kept going the direction he was going, and the honest answer to both of those questions scared him more than anything Derek had ever done in the 6 years Danny had known him. He threw a second bag into the truck. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't have to. He was 23 years old from foster care in Butte, and he had learned very early that you don't ask for permission to save your own life. You just move while you still can. What neither Derek nor Danny knew, rolling out of Garnett County in opposite directions that would converge on the same Wyoming highway before noon, was that inside the chapter house, a man named Razor was already on his phone. Razor was 31 with quick dark eyes and an appetite for power that he'd been managing carefully for 2 years, biding his time with the patience of someone who knows his moment is coming and is in no hurry to waste it. He'd been in the room for the meeting. He'd watched Derek take off the cut. He'd kept his face very still. Now he was calling chapter presidents from here to the Idaho border, and his voice was calm and organized and entirely without the kind of hesitation that would have been appropriate given that his predecessor was barely out of the parking lot. "Wolf went soft," he said. "I don't know what happened last night in that bar, and I don't care. What I care about is that he walked. We handle this correctly." A pause. "And if he resurfaces wherever he lands, we make sure he understands that walking away and getting away are two different things." The man on the other end of the phone said something. Razor's expression didn't change. "Find out where he goes," Razor said. "That's all. Just find out where he goes." He hung up. And somewhere on the highway between Montana and Wyoming, Derek Maddox rode with the wind hitting him full in the face and Ethan's bracelet on his wrist and no patch on his back for the first time in 8 years. And he felt not peace, not yet nothing as resolved as that, but the specific sensation of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has finally, at tremendous cost, exhaled. He didn't look back. That would come later. The looking back always came later. For now, he just rode. Tom Briggs had the kind of handshake that told you everything about a man in under 2 seconds. Firm without performance, direct without aggression. The handshake of someone who had decided a long time ago that he didn't have the energy for pretense and had made his peace with that decision. He was 53 years old, built lean, and weathered the way men get when they've spent years doing physical work outdoors, not for fitness, but because the work needed doing. 2 tours in Iraq with the 75th Ranger Regiment. 8 years building the Briggs Veterans Ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming with his own hands, and borrowed money in a belief that was either faith or stubbornness, depending on which day you asked him. He looked at Derek Maddox standing at his gate in the gray November afternoon and didn't blink. "Walter told me about you," Tom said. "Good things or honest things?" Derek asked. With Walter, Tom said, "Those are usually the same thing." He looked Derek up and down, not assessing threat, just taking inventory the way a man who has received broken people for 8 years learns to look at someone arriving. Reading weight distribution, reading the set of the jaw, reading the eyes. "You eaten today?" Derek thought about it. "No." "Come in," Tom said. Simple as that. No ceremony, no orientation speech, no forms to fill out. Just come in. Which was, Derek would later understand, entirely deliberate. Tom had learned that the men who needed this place most were also the men most likely to turn around in the driveway if the entry cost felt too high. Danny arrived 40 minutes later, which surprised Derek and didn't surprise him at all simultaneously. He pulled up in his truck and got out and looked at Derek across the yard with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite making it. "You followed me," Derek said. "I followed the address on the paper," Danny said. "There's a difference." Derek looked at him for a long moment. Danny held the eye contact, which took something. Then Derek turned and walked toward the main building and said over his shoulder, "Go find Tom. Tell him you're with me." The ranch had 11 men in residence when Derek and Danny arrived, veterans ranging from 26 to 58 from every branch carrying things in every stage of processing, some raw and recent, some years old and calcified into personality, some so deeply buried. The men themselves had forgotten they were carrying anything at all, and just knew they couldn't sleep and couldn't hold a job and couldn't stay in a room with too many people without their nervous system sounding alarms that nothing in the room warranted. Derek observed all of this from a careful distance for the first 3 days. He helped with physical work, fence repair, feed runs, stable maintenance, because physical work was the one language he had spoken fluently his entire adult life, and it required nothing from him emotionally, which was a relief. He watched how Tom moved through the place, how he talked to the men, how he had the specific gift of making a question feel like an open door rather than an interrogation. Walter arrived on the Saturday of the first week. Derek was in the stable with a gray mare named Soldier. She'd come in from a property seizure 6 months prior, severely underweight, head-shy in a way that made the ranch hands move carefully around her, because a head-shy horse that size could take your nose off without particularly trying. Derek had started spending time near her pen on the third day, not approaching, just being present the way he'd learned in Afghanistan, to let a situation develop at its own pace rather than forcing contact. He heard Walter's truck before he saw him, the particular sound of an old Ford with a loose heat shield that rattled at idle. He didn't go out, he stayed in the stable. He wasn't avoiding Walter, he just wasn't ready to stop what he was doing, because Soldier had taken 3 steps toward the fence rail in the past hour, and he didn't want to lose the ground by leaving. Walter found him there 20 minutes later. The old man stood at the stable door, read the situation in one glance, and sat down on an overturned feed bucket without a word. He watched Derek, and he watched the horse, and he was quiet, which was one of Walter's most underrated skills, the ability to be in a space without colonizing it. After another 10 minutes, Soldier's nose touched the fence rail closest to Derek. Just barely, just the tips of her nostrils. Derek exhaled slowly. "She hasn't done that with anyone," Tom said from behind Walter. Neither of them had heard him approach. In 6 months, not with anyone. Derek didn't look away from the horse. "She's not broken," he said. "She's waiting to find out if the next thing is going to hurt." Tom and Walter exchanged a look over the feed bucket. "Yeah," Tom said quietly, "that's about right." The first real conversation Derek and Walter had at the ranch happened that evening at the kitchen table after dinner, when most of the other men had drifted to the common room or to bed. Tom sat at the far end of the table with paperwork. Danny was somewhere. Derek had noticed him attaching himself carefully and without fanfare to 2 of the older veterans during the day, following their lead on the physical work, absorbing without asking. "How is it?" Walter asked. He meant everything: the place, the decision, the first week of living without the structure that had held his identity for 8 years. Derek turned his coffee mug on the table. "Strange," he said. "It's very strange. I keep waiting for something to require an immediate response, and nothing does. And the waiting for it is almost worse than when it was actually happening." "Adrenaline withdrawal," Tom said from the end of the table without looking up from his papers. "Happens to all of them. Your nervous system has been running on high alert so long it doesn't know what to do with quiet. It interprets it as a warning sign." "How long does it last?" Derek asked. Tom looked up. "Different for everyone. Weeks for some, months for others." He paused. "It gets better when you give your nervous system something real to respond to. Something that matters but isn't a crisis. That's part of what the horses do." As if on cue, they heard Soldier shift in her stable through the wall. A restless, searching sound. Derek's eyes moved toward the sound and then came back to the table. Walter watched this and said nothing and filed it away. 2 weeks in, Derek started talking to the other men. Not intentionally, it happened the way most genuine things happen: sideways and without planning. A veteran named Marcus, 34, Marine Corps, 3 tours, had been sitting alone near the fence line one morning, staring at the middle distance, with the specific quality of focus that meant he wasn't seeing anything in front of him. Derek sat down next to him with 2 cups of coffee, handed one over, and said nothing for a while. Eventually, Marcus said, "I can't make it stop." "Make what stop?" Derek said. "The counting," Marcus said. "I count exits everywhere I go, automatically. I don't decide to do it. I walk into a room and part of my brain is already doors, windows, sight lines. I can't turn it off. My wife thinks I'm not present when we're together. I am present. I'm just also always doing that other thing." Derek looked at the fence. "I do the threat assessment," he said. "Every room, first 3 seconds, left, right, back. Who's a problem, who's not. Been doing it since Kandahar." Marcus looked at him. "Does it stop?" "I don't know," Derek said honestly. "I haven't been in enough safe rooms long enough to find out." He paused. "But I think maybe it changes. I think maybe instead of an alarm, it becomes information, something you have and know how to use instead of something that runs you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's the most useful thing anyone said to me since I got here," he said. "And Tom's pretty good." Derek almost smiled. "Don't tell him I said it better." The mini-crisis came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week, which was also the week Walter came back for his regular Saturday visit and mentioned with the carefully calibrated casualness of a man delivering information he knows is charged, that he'd heard from an old contact in Garnett County that there had been activity in the weeks since Derek left. Unusual activity, men asking questions in places that weren't their territory. Descriptions that suggested the questions were about Derek specifically. Derek set his coffee mug down very carefully. "Razor," he said. "I don't know names," Walter said. "I know what I heard." "It's Razor," Derek said. His voice had gone flat and precise, which Tom, sitting across the table, recognized as a specific register. The register of a man shifting from civilian mode back into something older and more practiced. Tom had heard that shift before. He'd made it himself. "What are you going to do?" Walter asked. "Nothing," Derek said. And then at Walter's expression, "Not nothing because I'm ignoring it. Nothing because reacting is what he wants. If I move, I give him a direction to follow. If I stay still and stay quiet, he's looking for a target that isn't presenting itself." Tom nodded slowly. "That's sound," he said. "It won't last forever," Derek said. "He'll find this place eventually. Someone will talk. Someone always talks." He looked at Tom directly. "I need you to know that. If you want me to leave before that happens." "I don't," Tom said. "Flat, immediate, no deliberation. You leave, the problem follows you, and you're alone with it. You stay, it comes here, and you're not alone with it." He paused. "I'll take option 2. Danny, who had been leaning in the doorway for the doorway for the last 2 minutes listening, said same. Derek looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," Danny said. His voice had changed in 3 weeks. Some of the hair-trigger tension had softened out of it like a wire that had been strung too tight for years and had finally been given enough slack to find its natural tension. "This place is, I don't know. It's the first place I've been that felt like something I wanted to stay in instead of somewhere I was just staying." The thing that happened in Derek's face at that was brief and quickly controlled. But Walter saw it, he saw it, and thought about Ethan writing in his letter about the men he served with. "I hope they find their way home." Dad and he thought, yes, this is what that looks like. This is what that actually looks like in real time. The horses were the thing Derek hadn't expected. He'd assumed the ranch would be difficult in the ways he'd prepared for the proximity to other damaged men, the absence of the structure and hierarchy that had organized his life for a decade, the strange vulnerability of not being the most dangerous thing in whatever room he was in. He'd prepared for those difficulties. He'd made himself ready to endure them. He had not prepared for Soldier. By the 4th week, she was coming to him at the fence rail every morning. Not with the desperate, starved affection of an animal that has been broken into compliance. That was a different thing entirely, and Tom had shown him the difference in the first week, the way a broke horse moves versus a horse that has chosen to trust you, the specific quality of voluntary approach. Soldier chose. Every morning she chose, and every morning Derek stood at the rail and let her choose, and something in the rhythm of that, the daily, uncharged, consequence-free experience of being chosen was doing something to the calculus inside him that he didn't have language for yet. He mentioned it to Tom on a morning in the 5th week, standing at the fence watching Soldier work through her breakfast. "She doesn't know anything about me," Derek said. "What I've done, who I was. She just knows this guy shows up every morning and stands here and doesn't demand anything." He paused. "I haven't been known that way in a long time. Maybe ever." Tom leaned on the fence rail. "That's the whole mechanism," he said. "People come in here carrying all their history. Every relationship they have is filtered through it, who they were, what they did, how they failed, how others failed them. The horses have no history with you. Every interaction is just now, just this moment. And when you're with them long enough, your nervous system starts to learn that now is actually survivable." He looked at Derek. "You're not reacting to Kandahar when you're standing at this fence. You're just here." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Ethan used to say something like that," he said. "He'd say when it gets bad, find something that only exists right now, a smell, a sound, something your body is doing that's just happening in this second." He stopped. "I used to think that was something officers said to keep their men functional. I didn't know he actually believed it." "Did it work?" Tom asked. When he said it, Derek looked at Soldier. "Yeah," he said, "it worked." That was the Saturday evening that Walter didn't arrive. He'd called Tom in the afternoon. Derek heard Tom's half of the conversation from the next room, and the quality of Tom's responses made him come to the doorway. Tom's face was careful and neutral in the way faces go carefully neutral when they're managing information. He hung up and looked at Derek. "Walter's having some health issues," Tom said. "Nothing emergency level right now, but he's been at the clinic in Billings since Thursday. He didn't want to worry you." Derek stood in the doorway. The bracelet on his wrist was suddenly very present. He touched it without thinking. "How serious," he said. Tom was honest about what he knew and careful about what he didn't. His heart, his age, the combination of the two. He paused. "He's asking you not to come. He says you're exactly where you need to be, and he'll be fine." Derek looked at him. "That sounds exactly like Walter." "Yes," Tom said, "it does." Derek turned and walked back to the stable. He stood at Soldier's fence rail in the dark for a long time, not thinking in words, just standing with the weight of it, the specific terror of potentially losing the person who had handed you back your own life, right when you were just beginning to understand what to do with it. Soldier came to the fence, in the dark, unprompted, just appeared at the rail and stood close enough that he could feel her warmth. He put his hand on her neck and stood there. He was still standing there an hour later when Danny found him. Danny didn't say anything. He just came and stood at the fence on the other side of Derek and leaned on the rail and looked at the dark and was present in the simple, uncharged way that Walter had been present in the stable that first Saturday, and that Derek had been present for Marcus at the fence, and that Ethan Hayes had apparently been present for every man in his unit in a way that had made them all feel for the duration of a deployment in a country actively trying to kill them, like someone knew their name and meant it. The chain of it, the way care passed from person to person across years and loss and geography and the worst kinds of silence. "He's gonna be all right," Danny said finally. Not because he knew, because saying it was an act of will, a refusal to let the night go entirely dark. Derek didn't answer, but he didn't leave the fence either. What neither of them knew, standing in the dark with a horse between them and a wounded old man 6 hours north, was that 300 miles away, a convoy of motorcycles was assembling in a parking lot outside Billings. 12 bikes, maybe 14. Men in cuts with the death's head patch and a new president who rode at the front and had spent the past 5 weeks asking the right questions to the right people in the right order, and had finally 2 days ago gotten an answer that pointed toward a veterans ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming. Razor had found a direction, and he was riding toward it. The engines turned over in the dark one by one, and the sound, that specific layered bone-shaking sound that Derek knew better than almost any sound in the world, began moving south. Tom heard them first. He'd been a ranger long enough that certain sounds bypassed the thinking part of his brain entirely and went straight to the part that acted. He was in the kitchen at 11:47 at night when the distant rumble registered, and he was at the window and then at the phone in under 4 seconds. He called the Sheridan County Sheriff's Office, kept his voice level, gave his address and a description of what was coming. Then he hung up and went to find Derek. Derek was already awake. He was standing in the hallway outside his room with his boots on, which meant some part of him had been waiting for this, even in sleep, the old combat wiring that never fully clocked out the part that had kept him alive in Kandahar and in 6 years of club leadership, and that now, one more time, had delivered him to vertical and alert before conscious thought caught up. "How many?" Derek said. "Can't see yet. Sounds like 12, maybe more." Tom met his eyes. "You don't have to be the one who goes out there." "Yes, I do," Derek said, quietly, completely without drama. "If I'm not the one who goes out there, this becomes your problem. And this is not your problem." Tom looked at him for a hard second. Then he nodded and moved to the gun safe in his office. Derek put a hand on his arm. "No," Derek said, "not yet. Let me talk first. And if talking doesn't work, then we adjust," Derek said. The motorcycles were pulling into the ranch entrance when Derek came through the front door. The headlights were blinding deliberately, so fanned out in an arc across the yard, the oldest intimidation geometry in the world. And it worked on the limbic system. Whether you knew what it was or not, your pupils contracting your depth perception compromised every nerve in your body, suddenly very interested in what your legs were doing. Derek walked toward the lights. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He walked the way Walter had walked across Roadkill's bar 6 weeks ago, with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided on a direction and was at peace with whatever waited at the end of it. And in the place where his chest had always carried fear, dressed up as aggression, Something different was present now. Not peace, clarity. The kind that comes when you have finally at great cost figured out what you are and what you're not willing to do anymore. The engines cut one by one. The silence that followed was enormous. Razor got off his bike in the center of the arc. He was 31, and he moved with the coiled efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head and was pleased with how it was going so far. He had 12 men with him. Some of them Derek knew. Some of them were new faces, prospects, younger men, the next rotation of boys who had found structure in the wrong place because the right places had failed to show up first. Derek saw Danny standing in the doorway behind him. He turned and looked at him directly. "Stay inside," Derek said. Danny. His voice was firm, but not hard. The voice of a man giving an instruction he needed, followed not a command designed to diminish. "Please." Danny stepped back inside, stayed visible through the glass. Derek turned back to Razor. "You found me," Derek said. "Wasn't hard, Razor said. His voice was light, almost conversational, which was the version of him Derek had always found most dangerous. The loud ones telegraphed. Razor went quiet when he was serious. "Veterans Ranch. Old man, couple of horses. Very touching wolf. Very unlike you." "Maybe that's the point," Derek said. Razor walked toward him, slowly closing the distance to about 10 feet, then stopping. He looked Derek up and down, the absence of the cut, the bracelet on the wrist, the man standing in a ranch yard in Wyoming, who 6 weeks ago had been the most feared president in 3 states, and now looked from the outside like someone who had shed a layer of himself that he'd been wearing too long. "You embarrassed the club," Razor said. The lightness was still there, but something had gone taut underneath it. "You walked out in front of your own men. You put a cut on that doorstep like it was garbage." "I put it down because I was done with it," Derek said. "That's not embarrassment. That's honesty." "It's weakness," Razor said. Sharp final, the word landing like a gavel. "No," Derek said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his weight. "Weakness is what I was doing for 8 years. Staying in motion so I didn't have to feel what I was running from. That's not strength. That's fear with better equipment." Something moved across Razor's face. Not agreement. He wasn't built for agreement. Not in this context. Not with this audience behind him. But something. A flicker of something that was almost confusion. The expression of a man who expected one kind of conversation and is receiving something he doesn't have a prepared response for. "You came here for what?" Derek said. "To bring me back. I'm not going back. To punish me for leaving go ahead and try." He held Razor's gaze steady. "But look at where you are first. Look at what you rode 300 miles to do. You're on a veterans ranch in the middle of the night because a man you used to work for decided to change his life. And that made you angry enough to come here." He paused. "Think about what that says. Not about me, about you." Razor's jaw tightened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "That thing where you act like you figured something out and the rest of us are just too blind to see it." His voice had an edge now that the lightness had been covering. Real anger underneath. "You didn't figure anything out, Wolf. Some old man showed up and told you a story and you fell apart. That's all that happened." Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said his name was Walter Hayes. His son was Captain Ethan Hayes, U.S. Army, Kandahar Province, 2016. "Ethan pushed me out of the line of fire during an ambush. He died covering my extraction." His voice was level and his eyes did not move from Razor's. "I spent 8 years building something loud enough that I couldn't hear what that cost him. And Walter drove to a biker bar in Montana on a freezing Tuesday night, walked up to me in front of my whole chapter, and sat down and talked to me like I was worth talking to." He stopped. "You want to call that falling apart? Go ahead. I call it the first honest thing that happened to me since I came back from that war." Nobody spoke. Behind Razor, 12 men on motorcycles were very still. 2 of them, the ones Derek had known the longest, the ones who had been there since the beginning, had their eyes on the ground. Marcus was visible in a window of the bunkhouse. Then another window lit up. Then another. One by one, the men inside were awake, and Derek knew without looking that Tom was positioned at the door to the main building, and he knew without looking that Danny was gripping the inside handle with both hands, and he knew all of this the way, you know, the terrain of a place you've been sleeping in for 6 weeks, the way your body maps the geography of anywhere it has rested. Razor took one step forward. Last chance, he said, low, private, between the two of them. You come back to the table, we work this out. You stay here, there's no version of that where you and this place are left alone. Derek looked at him, and something happened in his chest that he would try later to explain to Tom, and never quite get right, a dropping away, a final release of something that had been held under enormous tension for so long that releasing it felt less like relief and more like structural change, like load-bearing walls being reconfigured inside him. He had spent years building himself around the threat of men like Razor, organizing his identity around being the thing that other threatening things deferred to. And now he was standing in a ranch yard in Wyoming with a dead soldier's bracelet on his wrist and an old man's phone number in his pocket, and 11 damaged veterans watching from the windows, and Razor was giving him a last chance. And the last chance was to go back to being what he had been. No, Derek said, one word. So simple it almost had no weight, but it landed between them like something final. Razor moved. He closed the distance, faster than Derek expected, which told him Razor had been closer to the edge of this than the composed exterior had suggested. He got both hands on Derek's jacket, and Derek let him. Didn't step back, didn't grab, just absorbed the forward momentum and stayed on his feet through the impact by dropping his center and angling his weight in the way that years of physical confrontation had made entirely automatic. Razor's face was 3 inches from his. You think this place protects you, Razor said through his teeth. You think these broken down soldiers and this old barn in Wyoming. Let go, Derek said. Or what? Or this gets worse for you, Derek said. Still quiet, still controlled. Not because of me, because of them. He didn't gesture toward the windows. He didn't need to. You brought 12 men to a ranch full of combat veterans at midnight. I want you to reconsider the math on that. Razor's hands tightened on the jacket for one more second. Then Tom's voice came from the doorway. Clear, carrying the voice of a man who had commanded under fire and knew exactly how much volume a situation required. Sheridan County Sheriff has been notified. ETA 9 minutes. You're on private property. The 12 men behind Razor shifted. Not retreat something more preliminary than retreat the collective recalibration of men doing rapid risk assessment. Razor's hands released. He stepped back. His eyes stayed on Derek, and what was in them was complex anger. Yes, and something that had almost become contempt, but had caught on something and hadn't made it all the way there. Something that was maybe underneath everything, the same thing Danny had felt in the garage in Garnett County when Derek had laid out the truth about where they were both headed. Recognition, unwanted and resisted and maybe ultimately unusable, but there. You're done, Razor said, not a threat anymore. A statement of fact, his voice stripped of performance. Whatever you were, you're done. I know, Derek said. That's the whole point. Razor held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back to his bike. He got on. He started it. One by one, the others followed. The arc of headlights swung around, sweeping the yard, and then they were moving back through the gate, back to the road, engines rising and then fading as the convoy headed north through the Wyoming dark. Derek stood in the yard until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he heard the crunch of boots behind him, and he knew without turning that it was Tom. 9 minutes was a lie, Derek said. 6, actually, Tom said. I called them before I came outside, but closer to 9 now. A pause. You all right? Derek thought about that question. Walter had asked him the same thing the morning he called from the parking lot in Garnett County. He'd said then that he didn't know what all right felt like. 6 weeks later, the answer was different. Not because everything was resolved, not because the weight was gone, but because he could feel the difference now between what he'd been carrying and what he actually was. And that distinction, the separation between the wound and the man, was new. It had been built here slowly in the daily work of fence lines and feed runs and a gray mare who chose him every morning and veterans who talked in the dark about the things that had no language and an old man who drove to a biker bar on a freezing Tuesday night and walked across a room that could have killed him and sat down anyway. Yeah, Derek said, I think I'm all right. He went inside and called Walter. It was past midnight and Walter answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. His voice was thinner than it had been in November. The weeks in the clinic had taken something, but it was steady. It was always steady. They came, Derek said. I know, Walter said. Tom texted me. Of course he did. Derek sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Walter had described the ranch on the phone 6 weeks ago. They're gone. Nobody got hurt? Good, Walter said. Then how do you feel? Like something finished, Derek said. He touched the bracelet on his wrist, like a door closed. Not the good kind, but the necessary kind. Walter was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the warmth of a man who had lived long enough to know the difference between an ending and a completion. That's what closure actually feels like, he said. People think it feels like peace. It doesn't. It feels like a door closing. The peace comes after. Walter, Derek stopped, started again. I need you to know something. Tell me. Whatever time you have left, I need you to spend it resting. Not driving to Wyoming on weekends. Not managing me from a hospital bed through Tom. Just rest. His voice was steady, but it cost him. You did what you came to do. You finished what Ethan started. You can rest now. The silence on the other end of the line was long. You sound like a man who has learned some things, Walter said finally. I had a good teacher, Derek said. Walter made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that required a moment to recover from. Ethan would be so... He stopped, gathered himself. He'd be very proud, Derek. I want you to have that. It was the first time Walter had used his actual name. Not Wolf, not son, Derek. Derek put his fist against his mouth for a moment. Then he took a breath and said, I know, I'm starting to believe it. Walter passed quietly in the hospice in Billings on a Thursday morning in late February, with enough light coming through the window that the nurse said the room felt warm. Tom drove Derek up for the funeral. Danny came too in his truck without being asked, which was by now simply the kind of man Danny was becoming, someone who showed up because someone had once shown up for him. The funeral was small, a few old colleagues from the school in Billings, 2 men from Walter's Vietnam-era unit who were still alive and still standing. Tom, a woman named Carol who had been Margaret's best friend and had been bringing Walter casseroles every Sunday for 6 years. Derek and Danny stood at the back in clean clothes, and when the pastor finished and people began to move toward each other in the way people do after funerals, a woman Derek didn't know came up to him and said, Are you Derek? And he said yes, and she pressed an envelope into his hand and said, He asked me to give you this before he wanted you to have it before too long. He opened it in Tom's truck on the way back to Wyoming. Walter's handwriting, deliberate, slightly compensated for the arthritis, absolutely legible. It said, Derek, you were never the monster. You were always the soldier. You just needed someone to say so. Ethan knew. That's why he made the call he made. Now you know too. Don't waste it. Walter. Below that in smaller letters, the coffee at Roadkill's is terrible, by the way. I drank 3 cups waiting for you. You owe me. Derek read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket next to where the bracelet rested against his chest when he wasn't wearing it on his wrist. And he looked out the truck window at the Wyoming highway unspooling ahead of them and said nothing for a long time. Tom drove and didn't fill the silence because Tom understood that some silences were not empty. Danny in the back seat fell asleep somewhere around mile 40, his head against the window, his breathing slow and even. The breathing of someone who had learned in small increments how to trust the room he was in. A month later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that held no particular significance except that it was a Tuesday and the weather had turned and the first real edge of spring was in the air, Derek drove to Roadkill's. He sat in the corner booth, the one closest to the back door, the one with the cracked vinyl seat. Denny, the bartender, saw him come in and said nothing for a moment. Then he went to the coffee machine. He came back with a mug and a plate, black coffee, cherry pie. He set them on the table without explanation. Derek looked at them, then he looked at Denny. Walter told you, he said. Walter told me, Denny confirmed. He stood there for a second, a large man who had broken up 4 serious fights and kept his hand near things under the bar and had watched an 84-year-old man walk across his bar room and change the temperature of everything. He came in a few weeks before he passed. Said if you ever showed up, that was the order. He paused. Said you'd know what it meant. Derek looked at the coffee and the pie. He thought about a Tuesday night in November, a convoy of motorcycles, a parking lot in Montana, a room full of fear, an old man standing up from a corner booth and walking toward the most dangerous thing in the room as if he'd already decided that the danger didn't matter as much as the reason. He picked up the coffee mug. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, and then another, and then the road was quiet. Spring was coming to Garnet County, whether it was wanted or not, the way spring always comes without asking, without ceremony, and different to the winter that preceded it. Derek Maddox sat at the corner booth with a dead soldier's bracelet on his wrist and a retired school teacher's last words in his jacket pocket and black coffee going warm in his hands. And the monster that had walked into this bar 6 months ago was gone. Not driven out, not destroyed, but outgrown. Shed like something that had served its purpose and was no longer required. The soldier had come home. Not to a place, not to a rank or a unit or a name on a roster. Home to himself, which was the only homecoming that had ever mattered, and the hardest one any soldier ever makes, and the one that Ethan Hayes had died believing was possible. He had been right. He almost always was.